And one of the things I did in the stone meter that really played to my own interest in biology was to assign each of these sort of data smugglers a code name based on the particular plant or animal that they were interested in, which was basically plants or animals that I was interested in. Because like most writers, I think I keep a folder on my computer of weird and interesting things. You know, story ideas for the future, a just-in-case file. Hey, this seems interesting, maybe I can do something with it file. And I have to be honest, 95% of that file is filled with weird plants and animals. Really weird ones. One of the ones that made it into this book was the fish-scaled gecko of Madagascar. A gecko that has only recently been, discovered in the last decade or so. And how many of you have seen geckos in your garden and maybe the cat catches them and their tail falls off? And they run off and they grow a new tail. Well, you haven't seen nothing yet because the fish-scaled gecko does not drop its tail. When it's caught, it sloughs its entire skin, it sort of flays itself, and then it skitters off up into trees like a raw chicken breast. And that is exactly what it looks like if you see pictures of this thing, this pulsing raw chicken breast. And you can see beneath this sort of naked flesh, these little pulsing organs, the little arteries. It's the most disgusting looking thing. And I saw this article and I thought, that's the most amazing thing I've ever seen. That is so repulsive, I love it so much. So that made it in here. And because I am a science communicator by nature, I did my PhD in science communication down at Otago. I thought one interesting way to talk about science would be to fold in information about these plants and animals through the medium of these characters. So the fish-scaled gecko in the stone meter is not an actual gecko. She is a scientist living in Madagascar where fish-scaled geckos live. And she mimics the fish-scaled gecko in her actions, in the way that she treats data, in the way that she hides it. For instance, many of these scientists in this book bury data. Or in the case of the stone meter, which lives down in the rock and pillar ranges in Otago, they hide it in the rocks and the pillars. The fish-scaled gecko hides it in the trees because it's an arboreal little critter. And so that's, I think, a really interesting way of talking about science, because as a science communicator, what I particularly like doing is using science fiction and fantasy to talk about science in new and interesting ways. Because I think COVID, if nothing else, has shown us what happens when science communication fails. Who here has heard 5G causes COVID? Anyone believe it? I hope not. I hope to God you don't. The thing that amazes me about this is that COVID is bacteria. It's a virus. There are little particles of matter they're talking about, and this argument that 5G causes COVID is like saying that 5G is scattering about like this sort of overexcited water hose. Particles of COVID throughout the air. I mean, if 5G can, scatter matter through the air, I wish it would do cupcakes instead. So we have seen what happens when science communication fails, and as a science communicator, it's our own fault. Scientists have been trained for decades. Right from the moment they go to university and walk into their first science class, they have been trained to make science inaccessible to normal people. Has anyone here ever been unfortunate enough to have to read a scientific paper? Didn't it just make your day? Boring. They are extremely specific. They try to be objective in that they strip out any human connection. The New Zealand Journal of Botany has, over the past decade or so, come to the conclusion that maybe it's all right in the methods section to say, I did this, rather than this was done by, persons passing understanding. So what scientists have done over these generations is to normalise a way of talking about science that's terrible, that cannot be understood by normal people. And so that, I think, is why we have the anti-vaxxers and the intelligent designers who say, well, do you really think, we're descended from monkeys? That's not what evolution argues. It's only a theory is always spouted by people who don't understand what a theory is. And it's not because they're particularly stupid. People don't refuse to vaccinate their children because they want polio in their house. They refuse to vaccinate because they don't understand what's happening. And when they go trying to do their due research on the internet, the information they can understand is generally written by people who haven't had training in science. If you go to journals in immunology and vaccine studies, they're terrible. You cannot understand them. I have training as a scientist. Pretty much the only science I can understand is botany and marine science, because that's what my training is. If I open a geology journal, it's as clear as mud. So even within the scientific community, we lock out other scientists. But locking out the general public is worse than that by a magnitude, because it means that we have a public who doesn't understand basic science, who doesn't understand the methodology. And so that's why I like putting science in my science fiction, because you need to be able to reach people in a number of different ways. Not everyone reads science fiction, not everyone should. People have their own preferences. But the people who like to read science fiction may find science in that more engaging than they do in the New Zealand Journal of Botany. God love it. So any questions so far? If anyone has any questions, just wave in the air, otherwise I'll be, ranting for an hour and a half about people who write badly about science.
Yes, I missed the beginning, my apologies for that, we just arrived, but so are you a scientist by trade as well as a novelist?
Yeah, I did my undergrad in botany, and I did a master's in biology. I researched seagrasses in Raglan. If any of you have been to Raglan, you've seen all the seagrasses just along the coast. They look pretty unprepossessing, seagrasses. Most people don't, think of them when it comes to your favourite and most beloved plant. But they are disappearing around the world at 5 times the rate of tropical forests, and they are the basis of a lot of coastal food webs. So if the seagrass communities, start disappearing, and they are having problems adapting to climate change, to warming waters, what does that mean for us? What does it mean for our local food webs? What does it mean for our fish populations? We have a lot of fisher people in this country. My dad used to help run the hoki industry. He was a marine biologist there. What happens if our fish stocks collapse because the base of the food web is no longer there? So, yeah, my background is in science, and I always thought that I would grow up to be a scientist because I wanted to do that. But here we come to the shift to science communication. I was so sick of reading scientific papers that I thought if I had to read another one, I'd just build a bonfire and burn all the journals in the library. It was so awful. The thought of having to read scientific papers for the rest of my career was the most depressing thing I could possibly imagine. And so when Otago started up this science communication program, I joined it in the first year they had it going. I thought, this sounds like me. This sounds like, something that could be interesting. Let's get people interested in science. Let's help them to approach it in different ways, because people love science. It's my experience that, you know, when they can access it, when they can be part of the conversation, they always really enjoy doing that. You know, they love taking part in experiments. So the New Zealand, has anyone here taken part in that New Zealand bird count each year? Yeah. Welcome to science. You're in it. People like doing it, because we have made science so incomprehensible as a vocation, because scientists have done that. People are feeling blocked out of science. So that's why I went into science communication. I'd point out now that the Otago Science Communication Program is now the largest in the world. We have beaten out Imperial College in London. New Zealand is a great big centre of science communication right now, and we're doing really well at it. So, yes.
Yeah. When I hear the term science fiction, you know, immediately I'm thinking of Isaac Asimov or space opera or something like that. And even though, you know, yours is called climate change science fiction, I'm still thinking sort of way in the future, weird and wonderful stuff. Do you think there's, you know, part of your communication needs to be, you need to come up with a better term? I mean, like, you have creative non-fiction, which is something real, but someone's added, you know, a bit of story to it or their own things to it. Do you think sort of calling it climate change science fiction sort of puts people off, and a more user-friendly term would work better?
I don't know. It puts some people off. I'm sure when I sent the Stonewet around to publishers, one of the responses I got from a major New Zealand publisher was, we don't think people will read about climate. It's only the major scientific issue of our time. I would have minded less if they'd said, no, we hate it, your writing's terrible. That they said, you know, people aren't interested. That was depressing. Because I don't think it's true. I think that people are interested.
But I think as a bookseller, if I said, oh, this is climate change science fiction, the minute I say science fiction, I've limited my audience to people who like that. Whereas, you know, it's probably more accessible. You know, from what you're saying, I haven't read your book, but it sounds more like it's like a climate change thriller, really.
Yeah,
you know,
it
so
is.
You know, that would perhaps be a term that people find more accessible.
There's the term cli-fi. Do you use that?
Yes. Cli-fi is short for climate fiction. Marie at Paper Road Press, who's my publisher there, we have actually been marketing this as a climate change thriller.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're absolutely right. Who here knows Margaret Atwood, who wrote The Handmaid's Tales? Yeah, she didn't describe a lot of her work as science fiction for years because of this. I think she preferred the umbrella term speculative fiction because it came with less baggage. Because when we think of science fiction, a lot of us, we do think Star Wars, we think Star Trek. And, you know, that stuff is great. My parents introduced me to both of those when I was a kid. They made sure that I grew up knowing who Captain Kirk was, because that was important. But yeah, for most people, they have this idea of science fiction as this quite remote thing, something that doesn't really touch them, something that's far in the future. Whereas really, to me, science fiction is about what happens when you take scientific invention or a scientific change and you dump it into society. What happens there? What are the ripple effects? Can anyone think of any examples?
Cell phones.
Cell phones. Remember Captain Kirk's flip top? Yeah.
Sliding doors.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sliding doors.
Sliding doors.
That's true.
Phasers, lasers.
I'm just glad for the theme me up.
Oh yeah, I was there. People are using those remote temperature takers now.
Yeah.
Oh, medical equipment is so far ahead of what you will.
Talking of medical, there is a reviewer called Judith Merrill who was working in the 60s, in the 1960s, and she was commenting that there are blind spots in science fiction for what is most likely to affect populations, the aspects of science that are most likely to affect populations. And she said possibly the only people more astonished than science fiction writers were Reader's Digest readers at the effects of contraception on society, because a lot of the writers of that time were having contraception in their works, but it changed nothing in the rest of society. I mean, if you think about what contraception does, the difference that the pill made when it came in the 1960s and the 70s, people could start planning their families with a higher degree of accuracy. It meant that there were suddenly more women in the workforce, more women going into higher education. When people start having fewer children, the population, you used to have a pyramid. If everyone has 3 or 4 children, it goes out. If it starts going like that, you need to start increasing immigration so that your economy doesn't collapse with a top load of, say, senior citizens who are no longer working. And this was the kind of effects that weren't being explored in science fiction, Judith Merrill was saying. So, yeah, we think of science fiction as spaceships and travelling to, other planets, more than we think of it as what happens if something like contraception comes to our society? What happens if people start, hiding data? I mean, everyone here heard of big tobacco and how they knew in advance that nicotine was addictive and buried the research? Same thing happened with big oil. It came out, I think, last year. That they knew that climate change was coming, they knew what the effects were, and they buried it because we don't want people to stop buying oil. So what do you do when you have people in power who are, say, personally or economically motivated to stifle scientific research? What do you do? Anyone?
Store data offline.
Sorry?
Store data offline.
Yeah, store data offline. Why?
So nobody can get to it.
Yeah, we are used to seeing all sorts of things on the internet. If you change a piece of source material, if you change a piece of research, how can you know that what you're reading is accurate? I mean, if someone puts out a paper saying, sea level rise is predicted by this model to rise, say, 2.8 metres by 2100. If that paper is altered to say it may, under certain conditions, do this, does that change impact? Yeah, it makes the conclusion seem less likely. It softens the probabilities. And people are afraid of climate change. They're afraid of the changes it might bring. And so they tend to want, I think, to look for reasons not to believe in it. It's the ostrich strategy. And it's really attractive. I mean, isn't it? So that is, I think, something we have to work with. Any other questions?
Obviously, when you're, I guess you're writing with an agenda, so
Yeah.
you
I totally am.
Yeah. How do you make sure, that agenda doesn't become the whole book and you're actually still sort of sticking a great story in there?
That's really difficult because it's so easy to cross over that line. And the story is so important. 1870, Black Beauty came out. Who's read Black Beauty? It's one of the most popular children's books of all time. And the depiction of animal cruelty in Black Beauty was so shocking to the society of 1870 that it actually sparked laws for animal cruelty and animal protection in the UK. And that is an incredible feat. That is, writing with an agenda and really getting results. But I think Sewell managed it because the book was so much a good story for the Stone Weta. I don't know that I've succeeded to that level. Part of it is that it's quite scattered as a book. It's almost more like short stories strung together with an overarching narrative. That is something that appeals to me as a reader because I tend to write the things that I want to read. If only because writing takes a long, long time and I don't want to be bored doing it. So I write the things that I would like to read. But what I like to read isn't always what other people like to read. So I think when you are looking to balance, agenda with story, then I think you have to sort of accept in advance that you're not going to reach everyone. That the people who don't believe in climate change are just not going to pick this up at all ever. Some of the people who do believe in climate change will pick it up, and they might agree with the agenda behind it, but they think, oh, it's a bit boring, a bit scattered, they don't like it. Other people will like it, it will appeal to them. And I think when I was talking about how important it is to get people to access science in a number of different ways, the same is true with literature. No matter who your favourite author is, there are people out there who will think that author sucks. There is no one who is university popular.
No, I was looking at Cassie.
So you were.
I do have a question now. You made a deliberate choice with this to have the main players be women, and a lot of them from the global south or less economically developed countries. Can you talk a bit about that and the role?
Yes. Pretty much all the scientists in my little web of scientists are women, and most of them are women of colour. There are two reasons for this. Firstly, the impacts of climate change are set to fall disproportionately on women of colour around the world, on communities of colour. Has anyone here heard of the Greenbelt movement in Africa? Yeah, a few of you. Wangari Maathai is the woman who came up with that. What the Greenbelt movement is, it's a tree planting non-governmental organisation that works to limit the spread basically of desertification. They plant around the edges of the Sahara Desert to try and sort of reclaim land. Maathai and the Greenbelt movement got a Nobel Peace Prize for this. Can anyone tell me why? Why would you think an environmental program would get a Peace Prize? Yeah.
I might be a little off with this, but I think part of it was because she was doing it partially to better financially lift up women.
Part of it? Yep, I would imagine it is part of it. Anyone else got a...
If it was extensive enough, it would change the microclimate in the area.
Yeah, it would. Resource management. What causes wars very frequently is lack of resources. If you have a limited amount of water, who gets the water? I mean, our community is just going to say, well, we'll thirst to death, you can have it.
Yeah.
If there's not enough food, if there's not enough trees for fires, for cooking fires, this sparks conflict. There's a limited amount of resources, who gets them? And that's the reason why I tend to think that Maathai and the Greenbelt movement got the Nobel Peace Prize, because it's a way of future-proofing against conflict. If you can make sure that your resources won't plummet in the future when climate change, sends all your arable land to desert, that is a way of ensuring peace in your region. And so I was quite inspired by that when I was looking at creating the characters for this. The other thing is, one of the other reason why I made them all women is that women in science, as in most vocations, they tend to work very well under the radar. They, especially in cultures where sexism is perhaps more rampant than it is in New Zealand, and we're not an entirely egalitarian society. Sexism exists there, but I think we all know in some cultures it exists a lot more. If you are overlooked, it's easier to smuggle data. If you are, doing all the social, let's keep stuff together, who's putting up the minutes, who's doing the grunt work of making sure everyone is connected and on the loop, it's easy to slip things in there. If no one's paying attention to you, it's easy to get things done. It's also easy, I think, to talk on multiple levels. I mean, some of the conversations between the scientists in this book, they're worried that people are listening in on them. And so they craft their conversations in ways that it looks to outsiders as if they're just chatting about their work, as if it's all entirely innocent. But no one who is outside the loop can really break the code, if that makes sense. And I thought that's something that that women are quite good at with general verbal skills and so on. So that's why. Partly because that's the way it's working in the world, partly because the effects of climate change and the disproportionate consequences on different populations, and partly because it's easy to get things done when no one's looking at you.
What age group is your book?
I hesitate to say adult science fiction because that brings in
Other connotations.
other connotations, yes. But
So it's not YA, it's
no, it's
Right.
not YA, but there's nothing objectionable material in here. I think teenagers could read it and not have their parents upset by them coming across
Science.
Yeah. they might come across disgusting details. Mum, let me tell you about this gecko that sheds its entire skin. Can I have a chicken breast? I want to see what happens. But yeah, I think mostly all ages. But it's certainly directed more at adults because I think adults are generally more aware of the currents of power that influence how data is presented.
Can you read us a wee bit?
Yeah. I'll go to the actual fish scale geckos. We're talking about those conversations that can be, taken in a number of different ways. And I've lost it now.
So are you a full-time writer now, or
Yes.
you?
Yes, I just finished up a couple of months or so ago. I was the Massey University Writer in Residence in Palmerston North at Square Edge this year, which was really interesting. About 4 days after I got to Palmerston North, we went to level 4 lockdown. And they were very nice. They said, Octavia, you can go home if you want to. But, it is rare for science fiction writers to get sort of literary residencies. In New Zealand, this was the first time at Massey that, a science fiction writer had got it. And I'd been waiting a year and a half, and no one was dragging this residency from me. So I said, no, I'm going to stay. And it was entirely isolated. I mean, I left just as we were going down, I think, to level 2. So pretty much for 12 weeks, I might have been the only person living in Central Square in Palmerston North. I was certainly the only one in the arts building, which was an extremely eerie experience. And Moorpork visited one day, just flew past, and I don't think you see a lot of them in the central city. But so yeah, I did that, and on Monday I'm off to the Christchurch Arts Centre for another residency there. I applied with a project about Ernest Rutherford, and I don't know if anyone here has been to the Christchurch Arts Centre. A few people. The recreation of Ernest Rutherford's lab when he was working at Canterbury University is in the Arts Centre in the basement, and apparently so few people go into it that they've said I can just go in there and write, which is for a science writer, that is, the apex of my life. The thought of being able to sit in Ernest Rutherford's lab and write about him is the most exciting thing I could possibly imagine.
Publishers thought people wouldn't be interested in your book. How did you get it published?
I found someone who was. Yeah. Why did it interest you? Marie can talk while I find the place
Oh gosh,
about this
can I?
conversation.
So I read the original short story, which came out in 2017, which Octavia published. And I was really interested to see how she had expanded on these characters' stories and their various plots and schemes and what was happening to them. Also the plotting and scheming that they were up against, the sort of faceless governmental and corporate forces which were striking back against the work that the characters are doing. So yeah, I was really pleased that Octavia sent it to me, and absolutely grabbed it with both hands.
No offense to me.
Yeah, I mean, part of the smuggling too, the data smuggling, was inspired a lot by the Timbuktu manuscripts. Has anyone heard of those? Timbuktu has an enormous amount of ancient manuscripts. They're really culturally important. And when the city was attacked by sort of Al-Qaeda, I think the ISIS influences in the past few years, the people of the city came together and they smuggled a lot of these manuscripts out of the city, because if they had been caught, those manuscripts would have been destroyed. And the interesting thing is they didn't have like a central library in the same way that we do. All these manuscripts were not organised in one place. I believe traditionally there, the books I read about it said that it was sort of family libraries. That these different families had responsibilities for these manuscripts, for passing it on. And so when the time came when the city was attacked, when these fundamentalists were coming in trying to destroy knowledge, these people started great chains of underground data trafficking, smuggling it out of the city, and that's enormously brave, because if they'd been caught, it wouldn't have just been the manuscripts to have been destroyed. And so that had a lot of influence on this too, because I was reading about this data trafficking at the same time as I was reading about, the archivists trying to save the data from the National Science Foundation. And that's why the person who is responsible for running the entire data trafficking network in the Stonewetter has the name of the Sandcat. She is from Mali, she's from Timbuktu. She has seen how data can be at risk, and she has seen how it can be trafficked and protected. And so when she sees it happening again, she's a scientist, when she sees it happening in science rather than history, she thinks, well, this is time to start up. I've seen how my community can come together. Science is a global community. There must be scientists out there like me who are feeling the same. And so that's how the whole smuggling thing starts. Yeah. Any other questions? I know exactly which piece I want to read, and can I find it? No, here it is. Talking about the sandcat and the fish scale gecko and how conversations can be read in two ways. The fish scale gecko was in constant contact with the sandcat. Madagascar was not Mali, but the fish scale gecko spent her days as a park ranger, encouraging ecotourism in the tropical forests. Poverty is a trap, she said. People need to live. And if slash and burn is the only way for them to make a living, then that's what they'll do. You have to find a way to make sustainable use of the forests economically viable. And I'd like to say at this point that Madagascar is actually using more and more ecotourism to protect their really extraordinary ecologies. The sandcat knew that, but she made appropriate noises anyway and was seen to take notes. Escape was a useful survival tactic, but camouflage was better. Ecotourism is proving a viable option then, she said. Over 50% of visitors take part in some form of ecotourism. True. The forests are a big part of that. Something I've found tourists particularly enjoy is being hoisted up into the treetops. It gives them a whole new perspective on rainforest ecology. That's particularly useful given how much tropical forest cover is decreasing globally. Of course, here they're not actually talking about forest cover and about how people like to be called up into the trees. They're talking about data protection and the data protection of climate change on tropical forests and how that data is stored in lockboxes in trees set up by the fish scale gecko. Other operatives might hide the data entrusted to them in the ground, but the fish scale gecko was a creature of heights and canopies. and when she stashed, it was arboreal. Is this just at the one location? Asked the sandcat. Still speaking, to outsiders anyway about tourism. For now, but it's a popular activity. Too popular, perhaps. I begin to think all the activity in one area is compromising the local ecology. Over the monitor, the sandcat froze. It was almost imperceptible, had not the fish scale gecko been looking for it. That's concerning. I've been scouting for new sites, but we have a busy program of local events coming up, so I might have to put it off for a little while. You've been so helpful, said the sandcat. I really appreciate the time you've spent advising me. I realise I've been adding to your workload. Would it be useful to put our consultations on hold for a few months? That's probably a good idea, said the fish scale gecko. Her skin itched and she could feel the talons closing around. So, on the surface, this conversation between these two women is about the effects of ecotourism on conservation in Madagascar, how tourism is helping the local economy, how it could be perhaps hurting the local ecology when too much of it is taking place at one site. Really though, they're talking about the attention given to data in that area, where it's being hidden, the attention it may have drawn, the need to keep data trafficking away from this particular site for a few months. It's a conversation that is happening on two different levels. And that's why Andy was talking before about, why women? I was thinking, because they can be overlooked and because they're good at conversations like this. Yeah. Any other questions about science fiction?
You mentioned Rutherford. What are you working on next?
I'm working on a young adult book about Ernest Rutherford. It's not the first time I've written on him. I wrote a novella called The Ghost of Matter back, I think, in 2015, 2016. It won, I think, the Sir Julius Vogel Award that year for science fiction in New Zealand, so that was really good. What a lot of people don't know about Rutherford is that when he was a teenager, his two younger brothers drowned. They lived in Pelorus Sound, in Marlborough, and his two little brothers, I think they were 10 and 12 or something, took out the boat one day, and they never came back, and no one ever found their bodies. His father searched for a year. I mean, if you can imagine walking up and down the coastline for a year looking for your two dead children. His mother was absolutely devastated. Apparently she was a very accomplished musician, and after the two boys disappeared, she never touched her instruments again. So what I did was to describe the splitting of the atom, sort of compare and contrast that with the splitting of the family. And so it had details of experiments intercut with reactions to this disappearance, to this horrible shock that the family had, which was contrasted with the wonderful shock of Ernest Rutherford when he did his gold foil experiment, for instance, when he found atoms bouncing back. And so that was something I was really interested in, because Rutherford is the New Zealand scientist of New Zealand scientists, essentially. And he has such an interesting life. What I've always enjoyed about him was that in the run-up to the Second World War, when he heard that his Jewish scientist friends, Jewish scientists he knew in Germany, were being fired from their positions, he set up a mechanism to get them out of Germany and get them into jobs in places like Canada and Australia and New Zealand. So he sort of helped get scientists rather than science data out of difficult positions. The one person I think he refused to help was the German Jewish scientist Fritz Haber, because Haber had been the person who invented chlorine gas in World War I, and Rutherford didn't want to borrow it. he had moral standards, and that was going too far. And I'm not sure he ever believed that splitting the atom would come to make a nuclear bomb. He died before that happened, but I don't know, part of me thinks maybe it was a good thing. I mean, would you want your life's work come to that? I mean, what a disaster. So that was a really interesting project that I really enjoyed working with. And when I heard that the Christchurch Arts Centre had the Rutherford Lab, I thought, by hook or by crook, I'm getting to that lab and I'm going to write something about it. And so I applied for a residency there with a project about August Rutherford and a young girl in New Zealand who, a contemporary story, like a teenage girl living today, having conversations with Rutherford, sort of almost in that lab. Maybe he's there as a ghost, maybe she's just writing letters and then pretending he's answering. But the potential for, I think, talking about science in interesting ways, to presenting it, the history of science to young adults, is something I think is really interesting. Because I have a particular interest in science history. And a lot of the short stories and sort of novellas and so on I write are in aspects of science history and how they can be related to what's happening today. One of the ones I wrote that I particularly liked was The Meiosis of Cells in Exile, about Lena Stern. Lena Stern was a Soviet biochemist during the sort of the Stalin era. And she was tough as old boots. In her 70s, she was arrested for being part of an anti-fascist league. And she was basically tortured in jail for 2 years and sent into exile. It wasn't Siberia, it was Tajikistan, or something like that, somewhere way out, away from the Academy of Sciences. And she was the only person in the Jewish anti-fascist league who basically survived. The others died in jail or were executed after show trial. And this woman in her 70s, the gumption, she survived her show trial, she survived that imprisonment. And when Stalin died, she hauled her 80-year-old ass back out of the gulag, basically, to the Academy of Sciences and went straight back to work. And I thought, what a wonderful thing to write about. What a wonderful story to share. Because, seeing the rise of fascist elements in governments and countries around the world, these histories of resistance that come from science is something that I find fascinating. Especially as she was so old, because a lot of science fiction is centered around young people, or young adults, or even if you look at Star Trek, 30s and 40s, there's not this little 80-year-old, 4 foot nothing powerhouse of spite, who, motoring along the tundra on these horrible railways, dragging herself back from exile and going straight back to work, because I think that's just fantastic. And I think there are so many interesting stories in the history of science that can allow people to learn about science in interesting ways. Does anyone know how Thomas Edison interviewed people coming who wanted a job with him? He wanted to know if they had the scientific mindset, if they just wanted to work for Edison or if they truly had something. So he fed them tomato soup. In his interviews, that's what he did. He gave them plain tomato soup and he watched. He watched to see who ate the soup and then seasoned it. And he watched to see who assumed that the soup would need seasoning and put salt and pepper on before they started eating. The ones who assumed got booted out the door because they didn't bother to test first. That's the tomato soup Thomas Edison test of employment. And it underlines, I think, the importance of testing of when you're in science, never taking anything for granted, of going out and, you know, making sure that every single time you're skeptical, even if it's like a bowl of tomato soup. So I thought he probably got from the soup test people who were scientists at heart and people who had been taught really good manners. Because my mum always says, you know, you put salt on your food before you even taste it, and it's true, I do. He would have kicked me out of the lab. And I love salt.
What authors inspire you? Who do you see as the people that you want to emulate or that make you want to learn?
Lauren Isley. No one's heard of him. He's an anthropologist, but he writes about science in this gorgeous lyrical way. He talks about the possibility of life on other planets, looking up at Earth, reaching out their tentacles or whatever they have. And the prose is so gorgeous. There's something so poetic about it. He talks about, he has a dog, like a German Shepherd, and the dog comes across a fossil bone, and it's breaking its teeth on the bone because, you know, it's solid rock. And he's trying to take it away, and the dog is, you know, suddenly the wolf comes out, and the dog is snapping at him because this is a bone, and he has a bone, and he wants to keep it, even though it's, you know, solid rock. And the way that Isley talks about this dog and the evolution from wolf to dog, it's astonishingly good. He basically, I mean, he's long deep now, but he has books of essays like The Immense Universe. Oh, they're incredible. They're really, really beautiful. Questions? Yes.
You're showing the power of storytelling, which is great. Thank you for that. Sort of bringing science to life through stories. What I was wondering is, does the science communication program at Otago have storytelling? Because I think science communication is seen as ways to make abstruse scientific papers readable, which is not the same thing as storytelling, I guess.
No, storytelling is the central part of the program down there. Because when I went, and I think what they do now, they still have three streams. They have the writers, they have the filmmakers, and then they have the other stream, which is basically the grab bag of people who aren't filmmakers or writers. They have, you know, the artists and the musicians and so on. But I think we all have to take certain papers, and the storytelling paper is compulsory for everyone. Throughout the entire program, the emphasis on storytelling is paramount. Because, you know, humans respond to story. That's right from when we're very small, hearing, you know, nursery rhymes and fairy tales. That's how we learn to interpret the world, through story. And the typical scientific paper strips out every aspect of story. I mean, we have spent decades, all of us, learning to respond to story. And when that's taken away, we just lose our legs, it cuts everything out from under us. And it's, I think, part of the reason why science is so difficult for people to understand, because of the structure and presentation of the scientific paper, because it goes against every useful piece of communication that we've all ever learnt. Does that?
Yeah, I guess the problem for scientists is that, or New Zealand scientists, is that whether it's a social science or so-called hard sciences, whatever, in order to be accepted in the International Academy, you kind of have to follow the international model.
You don't.
It's not that every scientist and social scientist would flick over to being storytellers, because that would kind of bring the universities in this country into disrepute, they think, internationally.
I mean, the whole organisation of the communication of science is so entrenched, and it has been so for generations, that you cannot write a readable scientific paper and expect to have it published. If you write a scientific paper and, you know, a normal non-scientist can read it, it would not be accepted. It really wouldn't. And how we got to that, I don't know. Ernest Rutherford, yay Rutherford, my favourite of all, used to say to his grad students and his colleagues that if you could not explain your experiment to a barmaid, you needed a better experiment. He didn't say that because he thought barmaids were thick. I've been a barmaid. Barmaids are not thick. He said it because he thought if you could not explain your experiment in simple terms, then you didn't really understand it yourself. If you had to fancy it up with, $10 words and make it so obscure that you and maybe half a dozen other people were the only ones in the world who could understand it, then something has gone very wrong in the way that you're talking about science. So yeah, how do we? Science communication is a growing field. It's growing in a number of wonderful ways. Social media is actually quite helpful for that. A while back I saw on Twitter this scientist who had made a stop motion model out of Play-Doh. It's this 3-minute video clip or something, and it was about her research on beavers and dams and forest fires, and how the construction of dams could sometimes, influence the direction of the forest fire. And I never read the paper. I assume when it was published it went to one of the journals, and it was, manipulated as we are taught to manipulate it into something basically unreadable. But every single person from a 5-year-old up who saw that stop motion video understood perfectly the results of that experiment. I mean, it was enormously clever, and I think that is the thing we need more of.
Rutherford is also reputed to have said, as New Zealanders, we don't have any money, therefore we have to think.
We have to think, yeah.
And then we have to think our way to better ways of communication.
Yes, cue a disgusting story from science, which delighted me. When you have limited resources, as Rutherford did, because New Zealand was very, very far from the centre of physics in the early 1900s. Science is expensive. I think we all know this by now. You tend to need lots of fancy equipment, and if you don't have it, you have the chance to mock up your own. And recently I was reading a scientific paper about poisons and sea anemones. It's from a university in Africa. I honestly cannot remember the name. I believe it was a Nigerian university, but I'm not quite sure. And they were talking about how they extracted the science from the chemistry and the poisons from these anemones to put them in to analyse them. And basically they used a kitchen mix. And they put it in, and you blended it that way. And I didn't know it was a kitchen mix, but I knew when I was reading the method section that I recognised that brand name because I like to cook, you see. And so I looked it up, and there it was, a familiar looking blender. And that is what happens when you have to think. Why is a kitchen mix any less useless than some $20,000 machine that some universities cannot afford? Science can be accessible. It doesn't need to be these excruciating, expensive experiments. It can be to get the people of New Zealand to look at the birds in their garden. It can be all sorts of interesting ways. Yeah, when you don't have the money, we have to think. So let's think in interesting ways. Let's think in ways that other people can respond to.
I think the Kiruru count is starting in a few days.
Well, make sure to look outside and count the Kiruru. Fantastic birds. What is the time? How much have we got? 1:57. Oh, we've got another half hour. Yeah.
I went to Madame Curie's film a while ago, and I was just astounded at what she started off with. And what Madame Curie, radiation and H-bomb. But, she just put down all the men because she was a woman. So, but incredibly determined.
Yes, Madame Curie is fantastic. I believe that film that you're talking about, Radioactive, may have derived from a graphic novel called Radioactive, which is astonishingly good. I don't know if this library has it, but if they don't, you should order it. Yeah, the graphic novel. There are a lot of good graphic novels about science coming out. They've been really astonishing, and this one was incredible. Its cover is even glow in the dark. Ridiculous story fact about Madame Curie. Her cookbooks are kept in a lead box in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris because when she went home from her work to start cooking, she would thumb the pages of her cookbook, and the transferred radiation is still to this day so strong that the cookbook has to be kept in a lead box.
No wonder she died young.
Yeah, she did.
What was the name of that book again?
Radioactive.
Just radioactive?
Yes.
Okay, and who wrote it?
Oh, I couldn't tell you. I could look it up for you afterwards.
Was it Jim Octavia?
I don't know.
He's written a lot of good science graphic novels.
I mean, that is one way to get young people too into reading more about science, because graphic novels are really accessible, and some of them are super clever.
What advice would you give to want to be climate change writers or climate writers, or whatever we decide to call them?
What advice would I give it? Anchor your argument to the real world, to things that people are afraid of or things that they care about. Because I think part of the problem of climate change is that for many people it's so distant. My stepdad always says he doesn't care that much about climate change, and I say, well, that's because you'll be dead in 10 years. It's not going to affect you. You should think about how it should affect your grandchildren. All these plans about potential water wars in 2050, you know, future generations are going to be living through that. Another thing too, I look at the effects of climate change on iconic species. Do you know what iconic species are?
Koala.
Sorry?
Koala.
Yeah, koalas, polar bears, pandas. Iconic species is a term from conservation science which refers to those species that get lots of love and attention. Because they're cute or fluffy or astonishing in some way. And it's easy to raise money for Safety Panda. It's less easy to raise money for the hog-sucking louse, even though it is equally endangered. I know, the name is ridiculous, but really, who's going to put $20 in a box for a hog-sucking louse? No one.
Yeah.
And the potential loss of some of these species due to climate change is, I think the effects, the psychological effects on some people will be immense. For me, it's the Great Barrier Reef, which is an ecosystem rather than a particular species, but it is dying at an enormously accelerated rate, and I have never seen it. And the thing is, I know if I go to see it, if I fly over to see it, I am participating in an action which will help it die quicker. But if that damn thing dies before I even see it, if it dies at all, even whether I see it or not, the loss, I think, is incalculable. The emotion that I will feel for that will, it's an extraordinarily powerful thing, and I think everyone has, you know, a plant or animal or an environment that they really, really love. And if it dies because of something we've done when we could have prevented it, it doesn't matter so much for the little non-iconic species. I think there is a small rodent, a rat-like creature that used to live on the islands north of Australia that has been generally accepted in the scientific world as being the first mammal to die to go extinct because of climate change. It's a rat, basically. I hate rats. They're awful. It's the beady little eyes and those horrible claws, and they've god awful tails. I find them repulsive. They disgust me. We have a writer friend who keeps rats, and I saw one of them in a room and I had to leave. It was in its cage. Oh, I'm phobic about them, and honestly, I don't care that rat went extinct. I know I should, but I care intellectually because we shouldn't be killing off other species when we can avoid it. But emotionally, it's a rat. If the Great Barrier Reef died, if elephants died, if the polar bear died, I would be ropeable if the polar bear died. Did anyone remember a couple of years back that video of the starving polar bear dragging its way across the Arctic ice? I ended up writing a story about that polar bear that took me months to write because every paragraph I was so angry I was nearly sick. That is how you get, I think, you get people into climate change story. You give them something they care about, and then you take it away. How would you feel if this creature goes extinct? How will you feel if the world warms enough that you're no longer able to live in New Orleans because it's just too dangerous? How will you feel if dengue fever comes to your country because a warming world changes the migration patterns of mosquitoes? I mean, everyone has different trigger points. And basically being a writer is a profoundly manipulative job. It's your job to find the trigger points for these people and hammer them over and over again. And to get some sort of emotional response to what you're producing. And because everyone has different emotional responses and different trigger points, then you need lots and lots of people writing climate fiction, because one book will not reach everyone. You need to reach a population rather than an individual. And so I think one of the things you need here is a sort of sea change. You need things happening in front of you. Has anyone heard about zombie starfish? From me. This is one of those animal facts, disgusting animal facts that I collect and spread with great joy. There is a creature called the sunflower starfish. Isn't that lovely? It's yellow and looks bright and happy. It's about 1 metre across. It has up to 24 arms. So you can imagine why they call it the sunflower starfish. It's also a zombie. It's being turned into zombies. The entire population is being turned into zombies with the warming waters where it lives. It's starting to get little white lesions on its body, and then the legs start to fall off. And apparently if the disease goes on long enough, it sort of starts to melt in liquid water. And when these legs rot off, they don't die immediately, they sort of skitter off in their disconnected, rotting, zombie, undead way. And apparently it can be quite hard in parts of the world now to find a sunflower starfish, because the places where they used to live in giant numbers have just become dead. Do we need to take our sunflower starfish into classrooms? Do we need to have them in a tank so that kids can watch them die in this horrible way before people start to care? I mean, what do we do here? These are repulsive examples, but they are examples that people can watch, that they can see. Did anyone here during COVID log onto an animal camera of some sort? Did you look at the albatross cam in Dunedin? You were, I think, ducks hatching or geese hatching in a railway station in the UK. It had a quite notable effect throughout the world this year that with the increase of lockdown, if people were forced to stay home in different places around the world, the view numbers of things like the albatross cam went through the roof because people were bored and wanted to interact with nature, and they could no longer go really outside to do it. So they dumped themselves in front of their computer and started looking up albatross. Some aquariums in the world actually wanted people to start zooming, interacting and talking to their animals, because they weren't getting human interaction in here. Yeah. And so I think this idea that you can sort of plug science through interaction with nature is a good one. But you've got to balance, you know, we don't want to horrify children with zombie starfish disintegrating while they have their maths lesson. But we do need to horrify some people with it, I think. And what a terrible thing. The destruction in a really disgusting way. I mean, disgust appeals to me in a lot of ways, but not this integration of this beautiful, weird creature. So I think we have to look at strong examples. We have to turn them into stories, even sad stories, even horrifying stories. And I think that's one way to get people talking about science and climate change in a way that affects them emotionally, because the emotional response is what is going to drive, I think, response to climate. We've tried reason. We haven't tried it very well because the scientists who are trying reason are relying on the fact that people are accessing their work, and they're not, because their work is not accessible. The motivation has to come from emotion, I think. Does that make sense? If anyone has an animal fact more revolting than zombie starfish, I would love to know it.
Does there need to be a process where people can read scientific journals and translate them into readable English without getting into trouble for everybody? I mean, doing it legally? Or?
Yeah, I think there certainly does. I think better would be to produce work that doesn't need to be translated like that in the first place, but that is clearly a long way off.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of the other end instead.
Yeah, when I was doing my science communication, I went over to Sydney to intern at Cosmos magazine. Has anyone read Cosmos? They're the science, Australasia's biggest science magazine. And at one point I was doing an article on dinosaurs. And the editor said, look, ring up this guy at the Australian National Museum. He knows all about this dinosaur. He can tell you. And he wanted to tell me. He did. He was super excited to be asked. I got the impression that he sort of lived his life in the backroom lab of the museum, you know, public engagement, yay. And he sent me, I think, just in response to the simple question, about 2 pages of notes, single spaced, you know, he put effort into it. I could use a sentence and a half as a quote. That is all. Because the rest of it was not, well, Cosmos is directed at the general public, people who are interested in science. His 2 pages of closely detailed information was directed at the people he worked with. He wanted to talk to the general public, but he had no idea of doing so. No idea how to do so. I mean, I had to look for that sentence. I was hoping to get some really good quotes out of him, but everything out of his mouth, no matter what I said, spurted out like it was coming to a journal. And that just doesn't work. Not for popular science, not for science engagement. So yes, I don't know if we need to have someone translate. I don't know if we need to have someone translating scientific papers as they come out. I think we need to start forcing scientists to making communication papers compulsory in science degrees. That is what I would do. The past year or 2 I've been teaching sort of basic writing 101 up at Waikato, and I try and encourage the science students to take this paper. They don't. I think well, 95% of the class comes from the arts. Few people from business, hardly anyone from science. It needs to be a compulsory paper. Writing, good writing, clear writing. It needs to be a compulsory paper in the science faculty for every science student. All of them. I mean, they have compulsory papers in other fields, in maths and statistics. when I was down at Otago, there were about 1,000 people in the first year stats paper. I think they said 6 of them were taking it because they were statistics majors. The rest it was compulsory because we were coming from different fields. If you can do it for statistics, you can do it for writing. And I think once you get scientists talking to people more clearly, once you embed that need for clarity in their education, then the journal papers will start to improve. It's going to be a really slow process because it's taken generations to get them this bad. But no.
They're going to need to learn 2 different types of communication, aren't they?
Yeah.
One's the professor and one's everybody else.
Yeah. And which makes it difficult. I mean, to some extent, you do need the jargon. The purpose of jargon in science, as in every field, is to be clear. But when you are underlining that clarity with sentence structures that are dreadful, when you are undermining it by stripping all references to the human out of your paper to the extent that you cannot even reference "I did this" in your method section. When the abstract is the clearest part of your paper, something has gone terribly wrong with the way that we're talking about science. I mean, you cannot blame people for getting it wrong. I mean, it's tempting to look down on the 5G causes COVID and the people in church who are spreading things when they shouldn't. And it's tempting to look down at the people who say vaccines cause autism and you want to reach out and shake them. But they're doing the best that they can with the extraordinary amount of information available to them, and the best written information is the unscientific stuff. Because that unscientific stuff tends to be more connected to story than the science. And there needs to be a balance. We need objectivity in science. We need the method section to be so clear that people can go out and repeat the experiment to see if they can get the same results or to see if something has gone wrong somewhere. But a normal person should be able to pick up a science journal and understand what's going on. Because if they can't, then what's the point of doing the science in the first place? Really?
Maybe it could be something like the science article written normally, like a research article, but then the summary has to be in English.
Listen to this, the summary has to be in English, as if the rest of the paper is not.
Yeah, because that's usually what I wrote.
Yeah.
To try and understand what they were talking about, basically, and then go back with that knowledge and read the rest of the article.
That is the purpose of the abstract. Generally, it's this little paragraph that summarises stuff that comes at the beginning of every scientific paper. No, it isn't. It's meant to be the most readable part of the paper, but it isn't. And even when it is the most readable part, that's sort of on a scale. If your paper is at level 10 unreadable and your abstract is at level 9 unreadable, it's not a great improvement. The abstract is still the clearest part of the paper, but if no one can understand it,
So I thought, what Randy?
Thank you.
I'm just wondering, you mentioned before about appealing to emotions rather than just the reason, or as a writer, do you have any tips or thoughts about ways of engaging people's emotions on?
kill the dog.
Kill the dog.
So often, isn't it? Yeah, it's that give people something they care about. Because if people don't, people have no emotions about things that they don't care about. I have no emotions about spinach.
Yeah.
For when you're writing novels or short stories, a lot of that emotion comes in, I think, with characterization. Because you have to make these people seem like people. They cannot just be mouthpieces for an argument. That is something that obviously I tend to struggle with sometimes, because I just want to argue. But you have to make these people seem like people. They have to have interests outside of the very specific thing that you need them to do. For some authors I know, they tend to plot down précis sketches. So this is my character, this is their hobbies, their family and so on, and they may not use all that information, but it's there. It helps them to construct a fully rounded person, and they trust that that, you know, comes over through to the finished article. I don't do that. It's not something that particularly works well for me. What I try to do is to make them seem human by giving them emotions of their own, something that people can identify with. I mean, if there is a character in here, I think, who is taken on at a university after a long period of unemployment. If you are aware of the way the universities are going, it's hard to get a job in academia. It really is. There's never enough money. Tenure is difficult. If you're doing grad work, you're often on a minimal stipend. And so there is economic pressure to not make waves. I think a lot of people can understand that. They can understand it as a motivation to say keep silent, to watch things happen that you don't quite understand. You know, if I was more financially secure, it would be easier for me to stand up and get involved in, say, the data cycle. These are the choices we make. I mean, give people choices, give your characters choices, because if they don't have them, then they're just going along on this almost predetermined track that you have for them, and it comes across as predetermined. Of course it is, because as the writer, you know you have a role for them. They need to do this and this and this. But you need to make them, you need to make readers think that they have options, that their characters have made choices to act in this way, and that those choices are sympathetic. Yeah.
But before you write, do you sort of plan a narrative arc or a chronology or what happens when kind of plan?
No. There is a scale in writing between the plotter and the pantser. I don't know if you've heard that latter term, the pantser, the person writing by the seat of their pants. I'm the pantser. I have this vague idea when I first started, say, the short story for the scientist smuggling data. And then I just wrote, and it worked out, and I cut the bits that didn't work out so that it looked more organic than it was. But when it came time to do the novel, I did have a little bit more of an overarching view. I knew I wanted to, to increase the sense of danger, to have, you know, some mortal events in there. Some of the scientists end up dead. Some of the scientists have to leave their positions. The choices they make, you know, how far are you willing to go to protect your scientific data? A scientist is generally an idealist. You go in there because there is this process for understanding the world, and there's something very pure about that. If you follow it, the hypothesis, the testing, the conclusion, and you keep going, it gives you a way of understanding the world that cannot easily be corrupted. For instance, who made those vinegar and baking soda volcanoes? Who has made them with their children? It doesn't matter what religion, what race you are. It doesn't matter where you live. It doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter if you have a disability. If you mix the vinegar with the baking soda, a specific result will occur. And there is something very idealized about that. And so a lot of scientists have this idealized way of thinking, you know, we can understand the world if we just do it this way. And then something comes along that undermines that. And it attacks in a way this purity of knowledge, this thought that, you know, doing my experiment, I can share it with the world. Our knowledge will be increased thereby. It will be of benefit to, you know, people living today, benefit to the future. People will work. You know that Sir Isaac Newton quote, if I can see further than others, it's because I stand on the shoulders of giants. Most scientists are not giants. They will never be. But they can put their own little bit of science in as a sort of little brick in a wall that people can, the scientists who work in the future can rely upon. It's a contribution to humanity's greater knowledge. And there's something very idealized about that. And when it comes to the point of, do I change my keywords because it's the only way that this paper will be published? Do I soften my conclusions? Do I go to this conference and give this paper knowing that it will upset my sponsors? There is a choice there, and it's often a difficult choice because we would like to think that we will all do the right thing, that we would be absolutely truthful in our responses, that we would say, no, of course you can't change the keywords. This is about climate change. It needs to be about climate change. But if your paper isn't accepted, if you don't change the keywords, it's publish or perish in academia. You know, if your job relies on you publishing regularly, if your children need feeding, you know, there are prices to being purist with your science. And often those prices don't fall upon you. So it's very difficult to have that balancing act. And I think generally the scientists in the Stonewetter are for, you know, science above all else. But there's often a cost for some of them, and they're very aware of it. So I think that's something that needs to be talked about more in the public sphere, the cost of science, the compromises of science, because they are there. Sorry, I actually get to watch it. Okay, well, 5 more minutes then. So if anyone has
Can I ask a question?
Yes. Go for it.
Thank you. I know I've come in late, but I read 2 things, and they're quite simple things. What is a normal person?
Well, when I'm talking about normal person, I'm talking about it in respect to science. People who haven't had formal training in science. People who just, I don't know, yeah, people who haven't had formal training in science, people who haven't been taught to read a scientific paper.
I don't see anything abnormal about that.
No, neither do I.
No, I was raised on the banks of the Manawatu River, right out at the end of Mackinac Road. And I was raised by some very wise people. They didn't read documents or anything like that. They just looked at the stars, and they taught us a lot of things about how we behave in terms of nature. And you don't forget things like that.
No.
Now, I heard 45 degrees over here, something like, you know, it has to be in English. What the blaze is for? Not everything is English.
Fair enough, yeah, it has to be, I think.
It has to be in understandable English, not in highfalutin chemical jargon that no idiot like me can
I think
understand.
that was the context that was mentioned. Was
I mean, you could.
It was something that could be understood, whether it be in German or French or any other language.
Well, I'm simply
non-scientific.
recalling that because that's the way I heard it. If there was an explanation that went with it, I probably wouldn't have brought it up.
No,
but put it this way, I'm happy to have been brought up in a society where we observed. We were an observing society. We still take our children and grandchildren down to that river, stand them along the banks, and we teach them how to observe.
That's what science is, I think. It's learning to observe the world. And in whatever language you talk about it, as long as as long as that language prioritises, I think communication.
Well, we all understand
Yeah.
it because we're all Māori,
Exactly.
but it doesn't mean to say we're anti any other race. Because that's not the way I see it, it's how I was raised.
I think the thing about science communication is that science in general has over generations excluded as many people as possible.
There's something really ugly that's going on now in science.
Yeah.
It's like people are going against each other to get the first thing, but I want to say to you that the cure for this pandemic is looking you straight in the eye, and we use that cure out in that value for our people. Not everything is found in the scientific world or laboratories.
No, it isn't. But science has been and continues to be the most useful way of gaining
I'm not
knowledge
saying it
about
isn't,
the
but I'm just saying
natural
that
world.
I'm happy with where I come from. I'm happy with the teaching that we had, and most of us out there came from houses with no bathrooms. We had no running water, so if we had a bar of laundry and soap that was shoved in your hand and sent down the river every day of your life, right through the winter. And we had to take that bar of soap back home, and that was our bathtub.
That must have made you very observant about
Remarkable.
conditions in the
I
river.
love it. You know, the fact that we had to do that because we didn't have bathrooms out there. We just, anyhow, I'm taking up your time.
That's all right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For hearing me out. It's really nice. Kia koutou for katoa aroha.
You're right.
Thank you.
Next question, can you stick around to sign your book?
Oh, yeah, sure. I think that was probably the end, and I have probably the next person lined up. I'm not sure who that is, but thank you for coming. I wasn't sure anyone would, so it's nice to see you. Yes, is there anyone here who'd like a kowhai tree?
Well, we've got space.
Oh, good. I'm sorry I was wrong.
Well, the trouble is that we do
Very good. How are you? I'm always happy to take other people's So, I think it's just with
yes, but I'm rather curious. What you're saying about it.
Hi, how's it going?
Some of them have more places.
Good, you want to hug
Well, basically,
I think so she had to. I'm always releasing people like as long as they're Why? I was tracking behind Ryan and I had a huge tower and several storage boxes. There's the tower station on the screen, and then it flew behind me and then under the next car.
out.
Suddenly,
And narrowly avoided storage containers and to like get past them, but like.
which was
I was like.
a measure of chance.
There was a storage container, I was like floating around the bank.
Yes.
This is a group.
Oh, yeah.
It's scary.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know, I'm cycling.
Yes.
What are you guys going to
It's quite a, well, it is. I'm trying to put it. I mean,
Cool. Enjoy.
yeah,
Yes. And then I come back.
the Wellington business
Then I will get
sort of was going.
I'll see you like that. It's gonna be
For a while, but it was going there's too much competition to it. So it was going uphill a bit.
Actually, right, so we, yeah.
So,
20 minute drive.
Alexander's brother,
Chris came with me.
Robert got more life.
He's just studying